Welcome to the summary and analysis of the Economic Survey 2023-24. You're probably curious about how India's economy is doing, with everything happening globally.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating year, to say the least. Globally, kind of a mixed bag, surprisingly robust growth, but you can definitely feel the uncertainty in the air.
Right. The survey mentions geopolitical tensions, inflation still being a problem, and investors being hesitant to make any big moves.
Exactly. But despite all that, it's interesting to see many major economies manage to climb back up and even surpass their pre-pandemic GDP levels. Shows you how resilient those economies can be.
Yeah, that is pretty remarkable. So how did India fare in this environment?
Well, India actually held strong, achieving a solid 8.2% real GDP growth in FY24, which, if you look back, makes it 3 years in a row with over 7% growth.
Wow, that's really impressive. What factors contributed to this success?
It's a mix, really. Domestic consumption remains strong, investments are still on the rise, and we're seeing growth across a variety of sectors. The survey really emphasizes the government's role in all of this.
Oh, right. They talk about government actions and public finances, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that India actually bucked the trend. Globally, a lot of countries were dealing with expanding deficits, but India went the opposite direction and tightened its fiscal belt. They actually managed to get the fiscal deficit down to 5.6% of GDP.
But didn't they also put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure spending? I thought that was a major focus for them.
You're right. This survey talks about how they prioritized capital expenditure. So putting money into things like roads, railways, telecom infrastructure, all those long-term investments that boost the economy's productive capacity.
So it's less about reacting to immediate problems and more about laying the groundwork for future growth.
Yeah, precisely. And now the survey is basically saying, okay, the government has built this foundation. Now it's time for the private sector to step up and increase their investments.
So the government is leading the charge and hoping the private sector follows.
You got it. And it's not just the central government either. The states have also been doing their part. A lot of them are also focusing on fiscal consolidation and making sure their budgets emphasize productive spending.
Yeah, the survey also mentioned something that I thought was really interesting about how states with lower GDP per capita actually get more support from the central government.
That's a key feature of Indian fiscal policy. It's designed to help address those regional imbalances and try to even out development across the country.
That makes sense. Now, shifting gears a bit to inflation. Globally, prices have been all over the place, but India seems to be doing okay.
You're right. Even with all that global pressure and some pretty unpredictable weather thrown in, India managed to bring inflation down to 5.4% in FY24. And a lot of credit for that goes to the government and the Reserve Bank of India working together.
So how did they pull that off?
Well, they used a combination of strategies. They strategically imported certain goods to stabilize prices, made some targeted cuts to fuel prices, and also made adjustments to interest rates.
A lot of careful coordination between fiscal and monetary policy.
Exactly. Though the survey does point out that merchandise exports took a bit of a hit because of global demand fluctuations.
Oh, I see.
Thankfully, though, we had strong service exports, which kind of cushioned the blow, so overall, the trade deficit was lower.
Okay, that's good. And what about foreign investment? Are investors still feeling good about India?
Based on the survey, it seems like they are. We've got those strong inflows of foreign investment coming in, which always helps to boost those foreign exchange reserves.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Hmm.
Now, on the social side of things, the report talks a lot about inclusive growth.
It does. The survey makes it clear that India isn't just about handouts. It's about empowering people and creating opportunities for them.
So not just giving people money, but giving them the tools to lift themselves up.
Precisely. Think of programs like the PM Ujjwala Yojana, the one that's providing LPG connections, or the Swachh Bharat mission, which is focused on sanitation, or even the Jan Dhan Yojana for financial inclusion.
Right, those are some of those big initiatives we've been hearing about. But are they actually having an impact?
Well, according to the survey, they are. They've seen a noticeable reduction in poverty, unemployment rates are down, and more people are participating in the workforce. So those are all positive signs.
It sounds like they're really trying to spread the benefits of economic growth to everyone.
Yes, and the survey definitely suggests that there's a strong commitment to making growth more equitable and inclusive.
That's great. All right, so the big question now, what's the outlook for the future?
Well, the survey is cautiously optimistic about FY25. They're projecting real GDP growth between 6.5% and 7%.
So continued growth, but maybe a little more cautious this time.
Exactly. They know there are global uncertainties, things like those geopolitical conflicts and how volatile the financial markets can be. But they also see a lot of strength domestically. Things like improved balance sheets for businesses and the potential for rural demand to pick up.
Sounds like it's a delicate balance between optimism and pragmatism.
Yeah, definitely. The next year will require keeping a close eye on both what's happening domestically and globally.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, but I am curious about how all of this translates to everyday life. I mean, what does it mean for the average person?
The survey paints this picture of an Indian economy that's navigating some pretty complex global challenges, but it's doing it with resilience and a focus on inclusive growth.
Okay, but what does that actually mean for someone trying to make ends meet or run a business or plan for their future?
I think it means that, despite all the challenges out there, the Indian economy is still in a good position to keep growing. And that means there are opportunities out there for businesses, for jobs, and for overall economic well-being.
So there's reason to be hopeful even with all the uncertainty.
Yes, I think the survey is sending a message of cautious optimism. There are definitely challenges, but there's also a lot of underlying strength in the Indian economy. It's definitely a dynamic situation. I mean, the survey even encourages people to really dig into the report and, understand what's happening in their specific sectors or whatever interests them.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much information packed in there. Before we move on, though, I did want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. You know, how India is getting pretty close to those pre-pandemic growth projections again.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, the survey really dives into that, comparing all those key economic indicators before the pandemic hit and where they are now. We're talking about GDP, private consumption, investment, all the big ones.
Right, so what's the verdict? Did the pandemic throw India completely off track?
It's actually pretty remarkable. I mean, it looks like those key indicators are growing at a rate that's essentially making up for the impact of the pandemic. So it's not just recovering, it's like catching up to where they were projected to be if the pandemic hadn't happened.
Wow, so no long-term damage to the economy then?
Seems like it. The survey says part of this is because of the government's focus on capital expenditure. Those investments in infrastructure we talked about, they really had a ripple effect. It stimulated demand and got private investment going.
So a really strategic and well-timed move by the government.
Absolutely. And they also point to other things that helped, like implementing reforms, the goods and services tax, GST, for instance, and the insolvency and bankruptcy code. All those reforms created a much more robust and efficient economic environment.
So they didn't just recover, they used the pandemic as a chance to build back even stronger.
That's a great way to put it. It wasn't just about patching things up. They actually addressed some of those underlying structural issues, so now the growth is more sustainable.
Makes sense. Now, were there any areas where the recovery wasn't as strong?
Well, they do point out that while most sectors bounce back pretty well, the services sector, specifically the gross value added, GVA, is still lagging behind where it was projected to be pre-pandemic.
Oh, interesting. What's causing that lag?
When you look closer, you see that certain parts of the services sector were hit harder by the pandemic, especially those that relied heavily on face-to-face interaction. Things like trade, hotels, transportation, basically all the sectors that got disrupted by lockdowns and travel restrictions.
Yeah, makes sense. Those industries were facing some unprecedented challenges.
For sure. And while they are recovering, it's definitely taking them a bit longer to get back to that pre-pandemic momentum.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even when the overall economic picture is positive, there can be these pockets where the recovery is uneven.
Exactly. And, it's really important to understand those nuances so that you can create policies and provide support where it's needed most.
For sure. Now, we talked a bit about macroeconomic stability earlier, and the survey really emphasizes how important it is for safeguarding India's growth. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. I mean, macroeconomic stability basically means keeping those big indicators under control. Things like inflation, fiscal deficit, and the balance of payments. It's about creating a predictable and stable environment for businesses and investors.
So a solid foundation for a healthy economy.
Exactly. And the survey highlights a few ways that India has managed to achieve this stability. One of the big ones is consolidating public finances.
Right, we talked about how India actually went against the global trend and reduced its fiscal deficit.
Yeah, they brought it down to 5.6% of GDP in FY24. And they did this while also increasing capital expenditure, which is pretty remarkable.
So spending smarter, not just less?
Precisely. They're prioritizing investments that will boost the economy's productive capacity in the long run. Now, you might be thinking, did they do all this by raising taxes?
That was actually my next question. Were there any big tax hikes?
Not really. The survey actually points out that India's revenue growth has been really strong, both in direct and indirect taxes. This was partly because the economy is stronger, but also because they've taken steps to improve tax compliance.
So a combination of factors working in their favor.
Yeah. They've also been really careful about managing their spending, focusing on capital spending and social welfare, but keeping a close watch on revenue expenditure.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it? Trying to manage revenue, spending, and also make sure the economy keeps growing.
Absolutely. The survey really stresses that this disciplined approach to fiscal management is one of the key reasons they've been able to maintain that macroeconomic stability, and that's made the environment more favorable for investment and growth.
Now, the report also mentioned something called the Macroeconomic Vulnerability Index. What exactly is that, and what does it say about India's resilience?
So the Macroeconomic Vulnerability Index is basically a way to measure how vulnerable an economy is to shocks and crises.
Mm.
It takes into account things like the fiscal deficit, the current account deficit, and inflation.
So a higher index score means the economy is more vulnerable.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that India's index has actually been going down in recent years.
So even with all the global turmoil, India's actually become less vulnerable.
Yeah. The survey attributes that to a few things like, prudent fiscal management, a stable current account, and the fact that inflation has been declining. Basically, it suggests that India has built up a certain level of resilience to all those external shocks we talked about.
Okay, that is reassuring. But are there any areas where they need to stay vigilant?
They do emphasize the need to maintain this fiscal discipline going forward. Their goal is to get that fiscal deficit down to 4.5% of GDP or even lower by FY26.
So no time to let up on the gas.
Exactly. They make it clear that achieving this target will require a continued focus on both revenue enhancement and expenditure management. So finding ways to increase revenue and making sure every rupee is spent wisely.
And speaking of spending wisely, the report dives into a topic that's been a major focus for the government: social welfare and inclusive growth.
Right. This is a big theme that runs throughout the entire survey. They talk about a significant shift away from that traditional input-based approach to a more outcome-oriented empowerment model.
Okay, can you explain the difference?
So in the past, social welfare was a lot about providing inputs, things like subsidies or handouts. But this new approach is more about empowering people by giving them access to basic necessities and creating opportunities for them.
So less about giving temporary relief and more about giving them tools to improve their lives for the long term.
Exactly. Think about initiatives like that PM Ujjwala Yojana that's providing LPG connections, or the Swachh Bharat mission focusing on sanitation, or even that Jan Dhan Yojana for financial inclusion. All of these programs are about giving people the tools and opportunities they need to break out of poverty and improve their standard of living.
And are these programs actually making a difference?
Well, based on the data in the survey, it looks like they are. They point to a pretty significant reduction in poverty, a decline in unemployment, and an increase in labor force participation. So yeah, there are definitely some encouraging signs.
That's really good to hear. It seems like that focus on inclusive growth is really having a tangible impact.
Definitely. They also cite some interesting stats from the latest household consumption expenditure survey. It shows that monthly per capita consumption expenditure has gone up in both rural and urban areas, and the gap between rural and urban consumption has actually narrowed.
So not just more consumption, but more equitable consumption.
Exactly. It's a sign that those benefits of economic growth are reaching a wider range of people.
That's really positive. But the report does acknowledge that there are still challenges ahead, right?
Oh, definitely. They do point out that they need to keep strengthening a statistical system. That way they can get a clearer picture of how all these policies and programs are really impacting people. And they also say it's really important to keep improving service delivery, to make sure those initiatives are actually reaching the people who need them most.
So a constant process of refining and improving.
Exactly. Inclusive growth isn't a destination, it's a journey. And the survey suggests that India is committed to staying on that path.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, I did want to touch on another really interesting section of the report, which is the role of states in driving India's economic growth.
Yeah, that was a fascinating part of the analysis. They highlight how important state governments have become in India's overall economic transformation.
So it's not just the central government, it's a real team effort.
Exactly. And the survey points to some interesting trends. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of state governments have also been focusing on fiscal consolidation, getting their deficits under control, and prioritizing capital expenditure, just like the central government.
So a shared commitment to responsible fiscal management.
Yeah, for sure. And they also remind us that India has this unique system of fiscal devolution. Basically, the central government transfers resources to states based on things like their per capita GDP.
So if a state has a lower per capita GDP, they get more support.
That's right. The whole point is to address those regional imbalances and make sure those less developed states have the resources they need to catch up.
It sounds like a system that's designed to promote more balanced and inclusive growth across the entire country.
Exactly. And the survey points out that because of this system, even states with lower per capita GDP have been able to increase their public spending, which is so important for stimulating growth and development in those regions.
It's really interesting to see how all these different pieces fit together. The central government, the state governments, fiscal policy, social welfare, they're all working together trying to create a more prosperous and equitable India.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. This economic survey paints such a complex picture of India's economic journey, but ultimately it's a really optimistic one. It's a story about resilience, innovation, and this deep commitment to inclusive growth.
You know, it's been an incredibly informative deep dive into this economic survey so far. We've covered so much, from global challenges to India's progress, fiscal consolidation, the power of inclusive growth. We've really gone through the data, analyzed those trends, and hopefully got people thinking about some pretty thought-provoking questions along the way.
I know, right? There's just so much to unpack here. We could probably talk about this for hours.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are so many layers to this. I really encourage everyone to take a look at the full report and, really dive into those areas that really pique their interest, for sure. Well, before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to leave everyone with something to think about, something the survey kind of hints at, but doesn't really address directly.
Ooh, I love a good thought-provoking question. Let's hear it.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about India's commitment to inclusive growth, right? All those efforts to empower people by giving them access to basic necessities.
Right.
But the survey also talks about how important private investment and entrepreneurship are for driving economic growth.
Yeah, they definitely acknowledge the role of both the public and private sectors.
So here's the question. How can India create an environment where both of those engines of growth, those public initiatives for social welfare, and that private sector dynamism can thrive at the same time and actually complement each other?
That is such a great question, and honestly, it's something that policymakers and economists are grappling with all over the world. It's not about choosing one or the other.
Yeah.
You really need both working together if you want to achieve sustainable and equitable growth.
Exactly. Those robust public initiatives are so crucial, to provide a safety net and make sure everyone has the chance to participate in the economy. But we also need that vibrant private sector, creating jobs, coming up with new innovations, and really driving that overall economic expansion.
It's about finding that balance. You need government policies and regulations that support private sector growth but don't stifle it, while also making sure that the benefits of that growth are being shared widely. It's a tough balancing act.
It really is something to think about, how to create that synergy. Get both the public and private sectors pulling in the same direction, working together to build a more prosperous and inclusive India.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt, but it's also an incredible opportunity. India has already shown what it can do, achieving impressive economic growth and making real progress on social inclusion. So the next chapter is going to be about taking all of that to the next level, and it's going to be fascinating to see what happens.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Economic Survey of 2023-24. We've covered a lot of ground today, from global challenges to India's economic progress, the importance of fiscal consolidation, and of course the power of inclusive growth. We've really dug into the data, explored those trends, and hopefully given everyone some food for thought. And remember, this is just a taste of what's in the full report. So keep learning, stay curious, and until next time, happy deep diving.